Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, this is Jessica, and I'm sitting here with
Pam and
Pam. Two Pams, and we are going to turn the page at Syosset Library. Thank you for being here, Pam and Pam. Although you're always here.
Yes. We're here more than we're home, I think.
That is true.
Yes.
We work here all the time.
So I have the pleasure of bringing these two Pams together. They are both librarians here, actually. So the first Pam that I am going to talk to is our assistant director. And when did you start at Syosset Library?
I started here in 1993 when my second daughter was in first grade. And I was trying to think of what I was going to do now. And I kept circling back to the library, and then I recalled that I had a library science degree.
You forgot you had a library science degree?
I had gotten my degree right after college. So I did some other things in the interim, and then I kept coming to the library because it was a comfortable place to be, and I thought, why don't I apply for a job here? So I applied for a job on November 16th, and I got a part-time children's librarian job on November 18th.
Wow, that's a pretty quick turnaround.
Yes, I was very excited, and I've been here ever since.
And Pam, other Pam, how long have you been working here?
I've been here almost 10 years now. I started in September of 2009 after my children were, I guess my younger ones were in fourth grade, and I went back to library school and started here as a trainee part-time.
So this is part of our Syosset Stories series, which means that you guys have an even more special connection to Syosset. You guys have both lived here for quite a while. Did you both grow up here?
Well, my family moved here in 1963. We moved to Woodbury, and I grew up here, and then I moved to Michigan. Then I moved to New Jersey, and then when my first child was born, we were coming back to visit my parents every weekend, and we decided to move back here.
Similarly, I grew up here my whole life and went to school in Albany, spent some time in Richmond, Virginia, Boston, Massachusetts, Forest Hills, Queens, and then right back home.
So that's one of the reasons I thought you guys would play off each other very nicely for this podcast series, because you both graduated how many years apart from Syosset High School?
10 years apart.
Yes.
But your experiences were very similar. So did you both go to elementary school here in Syosset?
Well, I started in 6th grade at Southwoods Middle School. And in those days, it was 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade there. And then I went to the high school.
They called it junior high back then?
They did. Southwoods Junior High.
And I started out at South Grove Elementary School, Thompson Junior High School for 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then, of course, Syosset High School.
Do you remember how many elementary schools there were when you guys started living in Syosset?
There were 10. There were 10, and over the course of my elementary school career, I think 3 of them were closed or slightly thereafter.
Do you remember the names of all of them?
I do. There was TV Summers, which was closed and combined with Robbins Lane, which is still here.
I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
TV Summers was combined with Robbins Lane. I guess it makes sense, though, because the people I know who went to Robbins Lane live in the area where TV Summers was, so that makes a lot of sense.
The other one was Locust Grove. That is now the Variety Children's Preschool. And the third one...
There's Split Rock?
Split.
That's going to be one of the baseline questions when I talk to people about growing up in Syosset, because when I moved here I believe it was 1984. I remember hearing of, I think it was Locust Grove was closing. It was either that or Split Rock, but TV Summers had closed a while
I think
before.
I think Split Rock is now just a big field with baseball.
I
Baseball
believe
field.
you are correct.
Well, I remember my siblings they went to Walt Whitman Elementary School, but the 5th grade was in the Woodbury School, which was on the corner of Woodbury Road and Jericho Turnpike.
And it's still there.
It's still there.
Is it
Yes.
being utilized, do you know, for anything?
That was, for a while, it was for sale.
It was administrative
Yeah.
offices for a while, and I know it was for sale, and I don't know what happened with that property. What's being planned for that property.
That's something to look out for us. So, what would you both like to tell us about your experiences growing up here? I see you both
Well,
brought your yearbooks out,
yes.
which is
Well,
pretty cool.
I think the high school was much different in those days. There were less kids there, and it was a slower pace. And now I believe there are classrooms. It used to have project areas. So, like project area A, B, and C had classrooms around the perimeter, and the whole middle was like an atrium, and it was a study hall. So that was closed up at some point after I graduated. And then my sister, who graduated 3 years after me, had split session. There were so many kids going to the high school then.
My brother had that too, so he was also 3 years younger than you. By the time I got there was no split session and there were no project areas. But I do remember that people were allowed to smoke out in the back of the cafeteria until there was some overdoses, and then of course the smoking area was moved to the inside courtyard.
Well, in my day, you had to sneak smoking in the girls' room, so there was no smoking allowed.
There was, I remember hearing that I think up until the late 90s, there was still a smoking courtyard. But I believe now that is not the case, as the age has been moved up in New York from 18 and above. But you do bring up a good point about just the space, because there are so many more hallways now than there were back then. I think there was a time when some classes there were trailers, and they've incorporated quite a few new physical structures to the school.
Right.
And you both had children who went through the Syosset school system
That's
as well.
Right.
So how did you feel it changed? You really watched it grow in real time.
Well, I think the availability of elective classes was incredible by the time my children went to the school. In my day, you knew what you were taking. Girls took home ec, boys took shop. You could choose between art and music, and those were about all the electives.
Well, it had changed a little by the time I got there because we had to take both home ec and shop.
Really?
And that was probably the first or second year that they instituted that.
I
that
shouldn't be
everyone
so
had to do it.
surprised now that I think about it. So did we.
But then I remember having a girls' gym in both middle school and junior high school and high school, and a boys' gym. And by the time my children went, the gym was not specific by gender.
Well, speaking of gym, in my day, my children had a choice of what to wear. They had to come in gym attire. We had to wear red gym suits, which were snapped down the front with a waistband and bloomers and one piece. And you had to embroider your name on the front and your last name on the back. And you were expected to know, I guess, how to embroider.
That was my next question.
I don't
You had to
remember.
embroider.
I don't remember the embroidery. I remember my name on it. We had the same red ones. By the time I think I got to junior high school, it was burgundy, and the top was burgundy and gray stripes.
That's really interesting that so it wasn't like you had the ability to, put your name on it when you were getting the gym suits. You had to embroider them.
Yes. Well, needless to say, I did not embroider it. My grandmother embroidered it.
I'm
so.
very grateful that your grandmother knew embroidery.
And then we also, swimming was mandatory, which I think it always is.
It always
It
has.
still is.
But we were given bathing suits to wear, which were made out of 100% cotton. And when cotton gets wet, it gets kind of heavy and droopy. So we were very attractive, I must say.
That sounds lovely. We were allowed to bring our own bathing
And that's
suits.
very nice.
Were they new? Did you get was it your own bathing suit or did it get donated back into
You know
the pool?
what? I never asked. Thank you, Jessica, for pointing that out. I have no idea.
It's just a good question.
Yes.
It's something. What your gym suits though? Did you keep them all for years?
Yes. After embroidering, yes. But that brings up another interesting difference. In my junior year, girls were finally allowed to wear pants to school. So before then, you had to wear skirts or dresses.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So I'm assuming you. I'm looking.
I was allowed to wear whatever we wanted at that point.
That's
Yeah, there was a dress code, and even in those days, the winters were very snowy and cold. And I remember standing out at the bus stop wearing a mini skirt, fishnet stockings, and white go-go boots.
That sounds really fashion
And you would
forward.
get to school, and your legs would be blazingly red from the cold.
Well, you really answered my next question, which was, so you had to wear a skirt. Did it have to be a certain length, and did you need opaque tights? But I guess the answer is no.
No. I remember at some of the private schools, they would measure the skirts, but not when I went to school. Not a public school. Right.
Yeah. Did you have any teachers that were favorites of yours?
Well, an interesting thing, I had Mr. Wallace for history. And when we went back for my older daughter's parent-teacher conferences, Mr. Wallace, it was his last year of teaching. So that was interesting. He looked practically the same, and everyone loved him.
Good genes.
Yep.
I also had some teachers that my children then had later, but not so many. And now I'm sure they're all retired. I had a favorite English teacher. In fact, I became an English teacher because of her, and that was my first career before I became a librarian.
Very nice. So, around town, outside of the school, were there spots where were popular to hang out in? How has the town changed since you remember it as children and teenagers?
Well, there was really no place to hang out when I grew up here. And we used to walk from Woodbury to Syosset. And there was a diner where the Starbucks on Jericho Turnpike is now. So we used to walk about 3 miles after dinner to go hang out. And you were allowed to sit in the diner. There was a 25-cent minimum at the table. So you had to order something in order to sit there. But that was really the only place to hang out.
We used to hang out a lot at the On Parade Diner, but also I remember in the winter we would go ice skating at the Syosset Woodbury Park, and then in the summer swimming at the Syosset Woodbury Park,
Which is still
there.
both available for for residents. I know that there were movie theaters in Syosset proper.
2 movie theaters.
2 movie theaters.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the United Artists Theater was where I had my first job. That was where the Equinox gym is now.
And that was like a really
it was
big,
a big,
nice.
It was the UA 150 theater. It was reserved seating, so people would purchase tickets like they did in a Broadway theater.
It had an orchestra. It had a mezzanine section.
Yeah, that was the smoking section up there. And I was an usherette there. So I had to wear a white blouse, a black tie, a black skirt, and white gloves. And you would show people to their seats, and they would tip you. So you kept your tips in your glove. And the best place to work was in the smoking section because you got the biggest tips there.
I don't remember it being assigned seating by the time I was in high school.
Yeah. The first movie was Hello, Dolly, which I have ingrained in my brain, all the songs and the dialogue. And it was a great first job.
What about you? What was your first job?
I worked summers at a camp called Camp Soreka, which was part of the Syosset schools.
I went there.
It was the summer recreation camp, and I went there, and then I became a counselor there.
How nice. That's pretty great. Did you, now when you saw your children grow up, did you find that there was more to do in Syosset proper, or were they really going outside the town?
Well, I think I used to drive my children around much more than my parents did. My father worked all day, and I would come home from school, and my mother would be out shopping or wherever. So there was really, I mean, I associated with the people in my neighborhood. We would just hang out at each other's houses for the most part.
You walked a lot, or you rode your bicycle, which my kids didn't really do as much of.
They were really more.
We drove them.
You drove
everywhere.
them. I know there was a very short amount of time where there was a roller skating rink in the area, but I think it was only.
I used to go roller skating. It wasn't near here.
I went to a place in Huntington.
I was thinking like Levittown or.
There was the Levittown lanes. There was a place called Laces, which I very vaguely remember. I think the only skating rinks on Long Island that are still around are Hot Skates and United Skates of America.
Well, actually, we used to skate outside.
Really?
On roller skates, yes.
Oh,
the metal
true.
roller skates, and you turned the key.
I didn't have
And
the key,
they
but
went,
yes.
yeah. Roller skated outside and went
These
sled
little roller
riding.
skates with four wheels. They
Right.
weren't
Not
like
the not the
now.
ones. Well, now they still they still have four wheels. They're just
In
not
line.
next to each other.
Right,
They're in
in line.
line with one another. It's interesting because so as you mentioned, the big theater is at the United Artists Theater is now a gym,
Right.
and the other theater.
Then there was another one on Jericho Turnpike where Marshall's is now.
Yes.
Yes. And my sister actually had her first job there. And that's where I remember seeing Gone with the Wind there and Around the World in 80 Days. And they would keep movies for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think now, just in general, there's so much more, and movie turnaround times.
There was another movie theater in Hicksville, and that was at what is now the Broadway Mall, but we used to call it the Mid-Island Mall, and that was a big hangout, too. You used to always meet your friends there.
It's interesting because
There were two other movie theaters. There was one where ShopRite is,
Right.
and there was one where, let's see what's there now.
The old
that
ShopRite
burned.
Across from the Plainview Library.
Well, there was one there, and then on South Oyster Bay Road and Woodbury Road, there was one on the corner there, where
Oh, where
that
ShopRite is
medical, where the medical building is.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot
where
more.
ShopRite is now,
There was another
our
movie
ShopRite, there
theater.
was a movie theater. Yeah, there were a lot of movie theaters back then.
Well, you couldn't watch it on at
TVs.
home. Yeah.
I know it's interesting. There was a Wetson's Burgers.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
that's right. Yes.
Where I think the McDonald's is now, or is it there was a Burger
Where
King?
Burger
Where
King.
Burger
Where
King.
Burger
yeah,
King was.
was.
Right. And
Yes.
that was kind of a hangout place for a while.
When I was in elementary school, I would walk home for lunch, and either my mom was home or once she started working, I'd make her my own lunch. But it was always special. I think one day a week my father used to take me to McDonald's, and that was like the best.
There was also where Chris and Tony's is. There was a Monero's Italian restaurant, and I remember we went there. In those days, we went out to eat on special occasions. So it was a special occasion, and we were in there, and there were astronauts sitting at the table next to us, and we convinced my brother to go and get their autographs, which I still have.
That's so cool. Which which astronauts do you remember?
Shepherd. I'll have to look.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, especially I guess when you think about it. Long Island has this really great connection with aviation in general. So when you go to the Cradle of Aviation Museum, you do see some NASA stuff. So how cool is it that that astronauts thought to come to Syosset to eat at Monero's, which
Right.
was fantastic, by the way.
Well, the other famous person I remember seeing was Billy Joel, who wasn't famous at the time.
Oh,
So
wow.
he used to play at it was where in Plainview Shopping Center where Lucille Roberts
Right.
was or is in the corner
Yeah.
there. So he used to play in a band called the Hassles.
Who had that
And-
song Down in the Boondocks?
That's right.
And the lead singer was a guy named John Dizak. That's who all the girls wanted to go see. But
Oh, wow.
Billy Joel was in that band.
And years later, we used to have a restaurant called Cristiano's, which closed in
Right.
the last few
Yes.
years.
Yes, it did.
And we believe Billy Joel wrote the song Scenes
Right.
from Italian Restaurant about that. That was a big date place. You'd always go there for a date. And I was with my husband-to-be at that time, and we ran into Billy Joel when he was first dating Christy Brinkley
Oh, really?
At Cristiano's.
at Cristiano's.
So we do. So at least we know for sure because
evidence,
the
yes.
question. Yes, the question has been, was it Cristiano's? Was it not? But Billy Joel clearly frequented it
we
with
did.
Christy Brinkley. So that's evidence.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the library. So before you became librarians, what are your memories of the Syosset Library?
Well, I went to the library first on Jackson Avenue, and that's where the children's area there was one shelf of books, and I went to story time there. And I think it was that librarian who used to do story times who inspired me to be a librarian.
That's fantastic. Do you happen to remember what their name was?
I don't remember her name, but I remember a book which was a favorite of mine called A Hole is to Dig. And I remember it was a tiny little book, and it was by Krauss, I believe. And I used to go home then and play librarian with my siblings, and I would be the librarian and stamp date cards and glue them into my books, and I would make them take the books out.
So wait a second. So then you went and you really always wanted to be a librarian, and then you went and you got a library degree, and then you forgot you had a library degree, but remembered and had a very fortunate career here.
Luckily.
That's awesome.
I also remember going to the library on Jackson Avenue, and this library here opened in 1970.
69.
1969,
Yeah,
1970.
started, yeah.
I was about 7 years old, and I remember my mother allowing me shortly thereafter to cross the street to come to the library by myself, which you would never do today across South Oyster Bay Road. So that was my library. And I did have a favorite librarian. I used to call her Mrs. Flukinger, but I was
Oh, she was
corrected
here,
recently
yes.
that it was
Uh-huh.
Mrs. Flukiger.
Flukiger. Yeah.
And she was very important to me. She always recommended very good books. I also had a great librarian at my elementary school, and I remember listening to her voice, and I remember learning about the Dewey Decimal System, and I also made my own little library at home and put
You did.
things in the books.
I would have come to your library.
I would have come to your library.
So when you moved away from Syosset, what were your experiences? Pam, you moved to Michigan.
Well, first I went to college. I went to Cornell, and I took I took design courses, psychology courses. Then in my senior year, I decided, well, I have to get serious. So I took accounting and marketing and economics, and I decided I can't be that serious. And then I moved to Michigan, and I went to library school there.
How did Michigan differ from Long Island?
Well, it was freezing there. The winter would start in October, and it didn't let up until April. So I knew it was not going to be my home for
Colder than
much
Cornell?
longer. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But I did meet my husband to be there, who somebody introduced us and said, "There's somebody here from Syosset." And I said, "Really?" And it was my husband to be. We started dating.
So wait, so your
And
husband
he was in Michigan.
from
He was-
Syosset?
Yes,
also?
he grew up in Syosset, and I remember a story. He was 2 years ahead of me, and I remember hearing about a friend of his who did something
We
that
don't-
was memorable at the time.
That's all we need to say. That's all we
Right.
need to say about that. But that is so cool that you went to a completely different state to not just, because you'll go and you'll meet people from New York because people from New York move around and often come back to New York. But to meet somebody from Syosset,
Right.
and then that end up being, the person who you marry,
Right.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I dragged him back to the east. He didn't really want to leave.
Well, I'm sure he's grateful for it. And yourself?
I also moved to different places. First, I went to school in Albany, and then I lived home for a little bit, and then moved to Richmond, Virginia, then back to New York and Forest Hills, and then up to the Boston area, where I had my first child, and then back home to be near family.
So would you like to... So Boston, was that where you stayed the
I
longest?
was there the longest, about 8 years, yeah.
And what did you find? What were the biggest differences between Boston and here?
It
Did you
was
live in the
also cold.
city?
Outside of the city, in the
Mhm.
suburbs, yeah. It was also cold there, and I want to say that I started working in a library, even though I wasn't a librarian. They had an adult literacy program, and I started working there as a volunteer, and eventually that led to a part-time job, and then I was the acting director till they hired someone, and so it became, my go-to place.
So I
Always
didn't
libraries.
know any of that. You worked next to somebody for so long. I did. Wow, that was quite an introduction to being a librarian and the library world. And then you were an English teacher
I
for...
was an English teacher for several years, and then when my son was born, I stopped teaching, and then I never went back to it. And then someone suggested that I look into library school, and it sounded like a good idea, and I knew I could sell my literature the way I did when I was a teacher in a less formal setting, and I really love it.
So the library itself, how would you say, you both went to the library on Jackson Avenue, and when you started here, it was smaller than it is now. How would you say things have changed over the years?
The amount of technology we have now in the building. There were no computers then. There was a card catalog back at the beginning. Now we have computers and video games and just so many other things besides books. Back in the day there were books, and if you wanted to do research, there were packets on different topics. I remember getting packets because you didn't have a computer to look up a topic, and that's basically how I remember it. It was reference, and there was fiction, and that's it.
You really had to rely on your memory, too. I remember working here, and the computers would go down, and you would have to think back, wait a minute, what number was that, and what author was that? And it was a good test of your memory to come up with books and to know where things were.
Well, we've been very grateful here in Syosset to have you guys as residents who come back and work in the community as librarians who are, meeting everybody at the forefront and providing excellent services. And if there is one thing you would like people to know about Syosset or the Syosset Library, what would it be?
Well, I think it's wonderful, the number of people that you meet every day that you don't really know that you're impacting. So, working here for 25 years, I go out into the community and I recognize a lot of people, and people come up and say, "Oh, my librarian," and it's just a great feeling to know that I've helped so many people.
And to be called my librarian, it's so personal. It's not the librarian, it's my librarian. That's
Right.
really nice.
As a matter of fact, the furthest I've seen one of our patrons was the Canadian Rockies. I went out to the Canadian Rockies on a vacation, and from across Lake Louise, I heard, "Oh, my librarian," and I turned around, and it was a family of patrons who I had helped. So I thought
That's
that
really
was great.
nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I think the Syosset Library is a great place to come visit. It's very warm and welcoming. The people that work here are great. So in addition to loving coming to the library to use the facilities, I love working here and being with such wonderful people.
Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences. And we're going to close this Syosset Stories chapter of
Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.